Have you ever discovered that the person who promised to stand beside you for the rest of your life couldn't spare a moment of kindness for the woman who gave you yours? What would you do if 4 careless words shattered decades of trust more completely than any affair or lie ever could? Most people think marriages end because of screaming, cheating, or betrayal in the obvious sense. Mine ended because my wife looked an 82-year-old woman in the eyes and said, "Figure it out yourself." She thought those words would disappear into the afternoon, like dust in the sunlight. She never imagined they would become the reason she lost everything that truly mattered. Looking back now, I realize that moment wasn't the beginning of the end. It was simply the first time I finally saw the truth I'd been refusing to see for years. Welcome to Stories for You. Find a comfortable spot, because today's story isn't just about what happened. It's about what people never saw coming. If you're excited to hear it, hit like and tell me your city or country in the comments. Now let me take you back to the day it all started. My name is Daniel and I'm 55 years old. I've learned that age doesn't automatically make you wise. Sometimes it simply gives you more memories to regret. My mother, Eleanor, had just turned 82 that spring. Her back wasn't as strong as it used to be. Her hands trembled when she poured tea, and she walked more slowly than anyone should have to. But she still insisted on living with dignity. She refused to let age steal her independence completely. Even after my father passed away nearly 15 years earlier, she kept her tiny flower garden alive, baked her own bread every Sunday, and somehow managed to remember every birthday in the family. When the rest of us struggled to remember our own appointments, she wasn't the kind of mother who demanded attention. In fact, she apologized too much. Every time I carried groceries for her or fixed a leaking faucet, she'd say, "I'm sorry to bother you, sweetheart." It always broke my heart because I knew exactly how many sacrifices she'd made for me, without ever calling them burdens. She worked double shifts cleaning hotel rooms after my father lost his factory job. She skipped meals so I wouldn't know we couldn't afford enough food. She sold the only piece of jewelry my father ever gave her just so I could attend college. Some debts can never be repaid, no matter how successful you become. When I married Linda 34 years ago, my greatest hope wasn't just that she'd love me. I hoped she'd eventually love my mother too. At first it seemed she did. She brought homemade pies during holidays, hugged Mom warmly, and insisted on calling her Mom instead of Eleanor. Watching them laugh together around the dinner table made me believe I'd been blessed with a family that truly cared for one another. But people rarely reveal who they are all at once. They do it slowly, in moments so small you almost convince yourself they don't matter. The first time I noticed something was probably 10 years ago. My mother accidentally spilled coffee on Linda's expensive tablecloth during Thanksgiving dinner. Mom apologized before the cup even stopped rolling across the table. Linda smiled and said it was fine. But later that evening, after my mother had gone home, she spent nearly 20 minutes complaining about how careless older people became. I remember defending Mom, saying accidents happen to everyone. Linda shrugged and replied, "Maybe it's time she accepted she can't do everything anymore." At the time, it sounded reasonable. Now I hear the judgment hidden beneath those words. As the years passed, little moments collected like tiny cracks in glass. Linda sighed whenever Mom called unexpectedly. She rolled her eyes if I drove across town to help with something simple. If Mom stayed for dinner, Linda always found an excuse to end the evening early. None of it was cruel enough to start a fight. None of it was obvious enough to accuse her of being heartless. Each incident lived in that uncomfortable space, where you question your own instincts instead of someone else's behavior. And I did exactly that. I kept telling myself marriage required compromise. I told myself Linda was just tired, maybe stressed, maybe overwhelmed. We all have bad days, don't we? I became an expert at explaining away things that should never have needed explaining. My mother noticed more than I realized. One afternoon, while I was repairing a loose cabinet door in her kitchen, she quietly said, "Daniel, please don't ask Linda to visit so often. I don't think she enjoys it." I looked up from my toolbox and forced a smile. "What makes you say that?" She hesitated before answering, almost embarrassed by her own feelings. "Oh, it's nothing. I just don't want to be the reason anyone argues. That sentence haunted me, not because it was dramatic, because mothers have an instinct children never outgrow. Somehow she had sensed what I had spent years refusing to admit. A week later, I had to leave town for one night to attend the funeral of an old army friend. Before leaving, I called my mother to check whether she needed anything. She laughed softly. "I'm perfectly fine." Then she paused. "Actually, if Linda has a few minutes tomorrow, would she mind helping me move the old dresser away from the bedroom wall? I dropped my reading glasses behind it and it's too heavy for me." It was such a small request that I smiled. "I'll ask her." "Don't worry." If only I'd known those simple words would expose the truth about my marriage more clearly than 34 years of living together ever had. The next morning, I made one phone call before driving home. By sunset, I understood exactly who my wife was. And by the following day, she would begin to understand exactly who I was. The drive home should have taken a little over 3 hours, but I don't remember much of it. My hands were on the steering wheel, my eyes were on the road, yet my mind kept replaying the voicemail my mother had left me just before noon. It wasn't what she said that unsettled me. It was how hard she tried to sound cheerful. "Hi, sweetheart," she'd said with that familiar warmth. "Don't rush back. Everything's fine. I couldn't move the dresser, but that's all right. I'll manage somehow. Drive safely." If you grew up with a mother like mine, you learn to hear the pain she hides between her words. She wasn't calling to complain. She was calling to make sure I didn't worry. That was exactly what made me worry. I tried calling Linda, no answer. I sent her a text asking if she'd been able to stop by Mom's house. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Her reply was only 5 words. "She'll figure it out herself." I stared at the screen at the next red light, hoping I was reading it the wrong way. For years, I'd trained myself to search for innocent explanations whenever Linda disappointed me. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she planned to go later. Maybe something unexpected had come up. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't protecting my marriage. I was protecting the illusion of it. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, Linda was sitting comfortably on the back patio with a glass of iced tea, scrolling through her phone as if it had been an ordinary day. She smiled when she saw me and asked, "How was the funeral?" Her voice was calm, relaxed, completely untouched by guilt. "It was difficult," I answered honestly. "Did you go help Mom?" She looked back down at her phone. "No." I waited for more. "Nothing." I asked again. "Why not?" She let out a long sigh, set her phone on the table, and looked at me as though I were the unreasonable one. "Daniel, your mother calls you for every little thing. She's 82 years old. At some point, she has to accept that she can't keep living like she's 50. I felt something tighten in my chest. "She wasn't asking you to remodel the house," I said quietly. She dropped her reading glasses behind a dresser. "She just needed someone to pull it away from the wall." Linda shrugged. "Well, she could have figured something out." I stared at her, hoping she would smile and tell me she was joking. She didn't. Instead, she folded her arms and said the 4 words that changed everything. "Figure it out yourself." For a moment, the room felt completely silent. I couldn't believe those words had actually come from the woman I'd shared more than 3 decades of my life with. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask how she could be so cold toward an elderly woman who had never treated her with anything but kindness. But I didn't. Years earlier, I probably would have. Experience had taught me something important. When people show you who they are without realizing it, don't interrupt them. I simply nodded. "Okay." She seemed almost surprised that I wasn't fighting back. "What? You're not going to start another lecture?" "No." She picked up her phone again, clearly satisfied that the conversation was over. But for me, it had only just begun. I walked into the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Memories I hadn't thought about in years began lining up in my mind, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. Every impatient sigh, every sarcastic comment, every family gathering she'd wanted to leave early, every excuse not to visit my mother. None of those moments had seemed important on their own. Together, they painted a picture I'd spent years refusing to see. That night, after Linda had gone to sleep, I drove to my mother's house. Her porch light was still on. She opened the door before I even knocked as if she'd been watching for me. "Oh, Daniel," she said with a gentle smile. "You didn't have to come all the way over tonight." I hugged her tighter than I had in years. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the bedroom door standing open. The heavy oak dresser hadn't moved an inch. Beside it lay a wooden yardstick, a flashlight, and a bent wire coat hanger. Mom had spent hours trying to retrieve her glasses by herself. She laughed softly when she saw me looking. "I almost got them." She said it like it was funny. It wasn't. I moved the dresser in less than 10 seconds. Her reading glasses were exactly where she'd said they were. She thanked me as though I'd done something extraordinary. I had to look away so she wouldn't see the tears gathering in my eyes. As we sat together drinking tea that night, she never once criticized Linda. She never complained. She never asked why no one had come. Instead, she talked about the flowers blooming in her garden and asked whether I'd been eating enough vegetables. That's who my mother was. Even after being hurt, she chose kindness. Driving home after midnight, I realized something that chilled me more than Linda's cruel words ever could. If this was how she treated my mother when the request was small, how would she treat her when she became truly dependent? That question stayed with me until sunrise. By breakfast, I had already made the first quiet decision that would change all of our lives. I didn't tell Linda about my visit to my mother's house that night. I didn't mention the bent coat hanger lying on the floor, or the bruises on Mom's hands from trying to move the dresser herself. I didn't tell her how relieved my mother looked when someone finally showed up. There was no point. An apology given after being caught isn't the same as compassion offered when it's needed. I wasn't interested in forcing guilt out of someone who didn't naturally possess it. Instead, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I stopped arguing, stopped defending my mother, and most importantly, stopped explaining why kindness mattered. I simply started paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I watched Linda more carefully than I had in our entire marriage. Once I stopped making excuses for her behavior, I began noticing things that had always been there. She never asked how my mother was doing unless other people were around. At family dinners, she'd put on the perfect smile, offering to refill Mum's coffee or asking if she needed anything. But the moment we were alone in the car, the complaints would begin. "I don't know why she insists on living alone. She's becoming too much responsibility. You spend more time worrying about your mother than enjoying your own life." Every sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they revealed something much darker. Linda didn't see my mother as family anymore. She saw her as an inconvenience. One Saturday afternoon, our son Michael stopped by with his wife and our 2 grandchildren. Watching the kids run through the backyard always brought life back into the house. My mother loved those visits. But ever since Linda had grown colder toward her, Mom had started declining invitations. She'd always say the same thing: "I don't want to be in the way." That afternoon, Michael looked around the table and asked, "Dad, where's Grandma?" I thought she'd be here. Before I could answer, Linda spoke first. "Oh, she said she was tired." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She didn't mention that my mother had quietly asked me the night before if Linda would be upset if she came. That question stayed with me all through dinner. Imagine being 82 years old and feeling like you needed permission to visit your own son's home. After everyone left, I drove to Mom's house with a container of leftover food. I found her sitting alone on the porch, wrapped in a light blanket, watching the sunset. "You should have come today," I said. She smiled without looking at me. I didn't want Linda to feel crowded. There it was again. Not anger, not resentment, just another excuse to protect someone who hadn't protected her. I sat beside her in silence. After a few minutes, she reached into her sweater pocket and handed me a folded envelope. "I've been meaning to give you this." Inside was a handwritten list. Names, phone numbers, the lawyer who had prepared her will years ago, the bank manager she'd trusted for decades, the accountant who handled her taxes. I looked at her confused. "What's this for?" She gave me a gentle smile. "I'm getting older, sweetheart. If something ever happens to me, I don't want you searching through drawers trying to figure everything out." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I don't want to talk about that." "I know," she said softly. Neither do I, but life doesn't wait until we're ready. As I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet, something caught my attention. One name had been crossed out. It belonged to an attorney I'd never heard of. Why is this one crossed out? Mom hesitated. Oh, Linda suggested I change my lawyer last year. I frowned. Why? She said her friend knew someone who could make things simpler. My stomach tightened. Did you? No. Why not? She looked down at her hands. Something didn't feel right. That answer echoed in my mind the entire drive home. Linda had never mentioned helping Mum with legal matters. Not once. When I walked into the house, Linda was sitting on the couch watching television. She smiled. How's your mother? For the first time in years, I answered with a smile of my own. She's doing just fine. It wasn't a lie. Because from that day forward, I intended to make sure she always would be. Later that night, after Linda had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and quietly began reviewing every financial record we shared. Every insurance policy, every property document, every beneficiary designation, and every legal paper connected to our lives. I wasn't looking for proof of a crime. I was looking for the truth. Because sometimes the biggest betrayal doesn't begin with stolen money. It begins with discovering exactly what someone expects to inherit, and how impatient they've become waiting for it. As the clock crept past midnight, I found something that made me stop scrolling. It wasn't a missing dollar. It wasn't a secret account. It was something far more revealing. And the moment I read it, I knew the next move wouldn't belong to Linda. It would belong to me. The document I found that night wasn't illegal. In fact, anyone looking at it would have thought it was perfectly ordinary. About a year earlier, Linda had increased the coverage on our life insurance policy. At the time, she'd told me it was simply the responsible thing to do as we got older. I remembered signing the paperwork without giving it much thought. But as I looked through the files again, something else caught my attention. Along with the policy were pages listing our retirement accounts, savings and investment portfolios. Every file had neat handwritten notes in the margins, in Linda's handwriting. One note read, "House will be mortgage-free in 3 years." Another said, "Mum's property will probably be sold after." The sentence wasn't finished, but it didn't need to be. I leaned back in my chair and closed the folder. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe those notes meant nothing. But after everything that had happened, I could no longer ignore the pattern. Linda seemed to think about the future in a very different way than I did. When I looked ahead, I saw family dinners, birthdays, and more time with the people I loved. When she looked ahead, she seemed to see assets, houses, and bank accounts. The next morning, I took the day off work without telling her why. Instead of going to the office, I drove straight to my mother's house. She was in the garden, struggling to trim her rose bushes with aching hands. "You should have called me," I said as I gently took the shears from her. She smiled. "I didn't want to bother you." I laughed quietly. "You've spent your whole life taking care of me. Let me return the favor." She looked at me for a long moment before saying something that caught me completely off guard. "You've been quieter lately." "I have?" She nodded. "You've stopped defending Linda." I froze. My mother wasn't losing her sharpness after all. She had noticed everything. "I don't want you choosing between us," she said softly. I knelt beside her chair. "I'm not choosing between you and anyone else. I'm choosing between right and wrong." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Just promise me one thing. Anything. Don't become bitter." Those words stayed with me long after I left. I wasn't interested in revenge driven by anger. I wanted justice guided by truth. That afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with the attorney, whose name my mother had given me. Years earlier, he had handled my parents' legal affairs for decades and remembered my father well. After listening quietly to everything I shared, he folded his hands across the desk. "Daniel," he said, "people often wait until after a tragedy to organize their affairs. You're doing the wise thing by reviewing everything now." I asked him a simple question. If I wanted to make sure my mother's wishes are protected, and that my own are as well, what should I do? For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every document that mattered. My will, my beneficiaries, power of attorney, medical directives, property ownership. None of it was dramatic. But every change placed control back into the hands of the people I trusted. When I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace, not because I had punished anyone, because I had quietly removed every opportunity for someone to take advantage of the people I loved. Over the following weeks, I noticed something interesting. Linda kept asking unusual questions. When are you planning to retire? Has your mom ever talked about selling her house? Have you updated any of the financial paperwork lately? I answered every question with the same calm smile. We're doing just fine. The less information I gave her, the more curious she became. She started checking the mailbox before I got home. She asked whether I'd been meeting with anyone during lunch breaks. One evening, she even casually mentioned that it might be a good idea for all of us to meet with a financial planner together. A month earlier, I probably would have agreed without thinking. Now I simply said, I'll let you know if that becomes necessary. For the first time in our marriage, Linda wasn't controlling the conversation. She was reacting to mine, and she hated it. She didn't realize that every question she asked only confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The balance of our marriage had shifted. She thought I was becoming distant. She had no idea I was becoming prepared, because while she was trying to find out what I was planning, there was one conversation already scheduled that would change everything she believed she knew about our future. That conversation took place on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I didn't tell Linda where I was going. I simply said I had a few errands to run. In reality, I was meeting with my attorney one final time to sign the documents we'd spent weeks preparing. There was no dramatic courtroom, no confrontation, no shouting, just a calm office, a stack of papers, and a decision that had taken me 34 years to make. When I picked up the pen, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. My estate was updated. My beneficiaries reflected the people who had shown loyalty instead of convenience. I created a separate trust to ensure my mother's care would always come first if anything ever happened to me. I also made arrangements so that my son, Michael, would oversee those decisions, not because I loved him more than anyone else, but because he had proven, time and again, that he valued people more than possessions. As I shook my attorney's hand, he smiled and said, "Most people think estate planning is about money. It's really about protecting your values." Those words stayed with me. I wasn't protecting dollars. I was protecting dignity. A few days later, my mother slipped while watering her flowers. Thankfully, she wasn't seriously injured, but she strained her hip badly, enough that her doctor insisted she shouldn't be living alone for a while. Without hesitation, I said, "Mom, you're coming to stay with me." She looked worried. "What will Linda think?" I smiled gently. "This is my home too." When we arrived, Linda forced a smile. "Oh, I didn't realize she'd be staying." "Neither did I replied. "But family helps family." She nodded politely, but I could see the disappointment flash across her face before she hid it. The first few days were tense. Mom apologized constantly for taking up space. Linda remained polite whenever I was in the room. But whenever she thought I wasn't paying attention, the warmth disappeared. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen just in time to hear Linda say, "You know, Eleanor, assisted living communities are actually very nice these days." Mom smiled awkwardly. "I'll only be here until my hip feels better." Linda gave a tight smile. "I'm sure." She didn't know I had heard every word. I didn't confront her. I simply kept watching. A week later, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. He brought groceries for Grandma, fixed a loose handrail on the front porch, and spent an hour playing cards with her at the dining table. Before leaving, he quietly pulled me aside. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Is everything okay between you and Linda?" I looked at him. "Why would you ask that?" He hesitated. "Because Grandma keeps apologizing for existing." His words hit me harder than anything Linda had ever said. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room. I realized something painful. My mother wasn't afraid of getting older. She was afraid of being unwanted. No parent who spent a lifetime sacrificing for their children should ever feel that way. The next morning, I made one final decision. I arranged for professional in-home assistance for my mother, not because I couldn't care for her, but because I wanted her surrounded by people whose job was rooted in compassion rather than obligation. Then I quietly purchased the small house next door that had recently gone on the market. After a few renovations, it became the perfect place for Mom. Close enough that I could see her every day, independent enough that she never felt like a burden. When I handed her the keys, tears filled her eyes. "Daniel, I can't accept this." "You already have," I said softly. "You accepted it the day you spent your last dollar making sure I had a future. This is simply my turn." For the first time in months, I saw genuine peace on her face. Linda watched everything unfold in complete silence. She couldn't understand how decisions were being made without her input. She had spent years assuming she knew exactly how our future would look. Now that future was changing one quiet decision at a time. Then one evening, she walked into my home office holding an envelope she'd accidentally opened after checking the mail. It was from my attorney. She looked at me nervously. "You updated your will?" I calmly took the envelope from her hand. "Yes." Without telling me, I looked her directly in the eyes. "The day you looked at my 82-year-old mother and told her to figure it out yourself, I realized I needed to. For the first time since our marriage began." Linda had absolutely nothing to say. She finally understood that quiet decisions often carry the loudest consequences. But she still didn't know the one truth that would change her life forever. And she was about to find out. Linda hardly spoke to me after that conversation. The silence in our home felt different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence that comes after years of marriage. It was the silence of two people who finally understood they were no longer walking in the same direction. For several days, she acted as though nothing had happened. She cooked dinner, watched television, and carried on with her routine. But I could see the questions behind her eyes. She wanted to know what had changed in my will. She wanted to know what my attorney had done. More than anything, she wanted to know whether her future was still as secure as she'd always believed. One evening, she finally asked, "Daniel, are you going to tell me what's in those documents?" I looked at her calmly. "I've already told you everything you need to know." "No, you haven't." "Yes, I have." She frowned. "When?" "The day you told my 82-year-old mother to figure it out yourself. That was the day I realized I couldn't trust you to protect the people. I love if I wasn't here to do it myself." She looked away. "I said something I shouldn't have." "It wasn't just something you said." She remained silent. "It was something you believed." For the first time in years, she didn't try to defend herself. She knew I was right. A week later, I asked her to meet me in the living room. The documents were neatly arranged on the coffee table. She looked nervous as she sat down. "I've made a decision," I said. "I'm listening." "I've filed for divorce." The color drained from her face. "You're divorcing me?" "Over one sentence?" I shook my head. "No." I spoke as calmly as I ever had. "I'm divorcing you because one sentence revealed 34 years of hidden truth." Tears filled her eyes. "I can change. I believe people can change." She looked hopeful. But change only matters before someone gets hurt, not after. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I never thought you'd leave."
I know.
"Why didn't you yell at me?" "Because yelling would have made me feel better for 5 minutes." I paused before continuing. But staying calm protected my mother for the rest of her life. She covered her face with her hands. "I've made the biggest mistake of my life." I didn't argue with her. Maybe she had. Maybe she hadn't. That wasn't for me to decide anymore. The divorce wasn't cruel. It wasn't vindictive. She received exactly what the law considered fair. Nothing more. Nothing less. The rest of what I had built over a lifetime was placed where I knew it would serve the people who valued love over convenience. Months passed. My mother's hip healed beautifully. She settled into the little house next door with a happiness I hadn't seen in years. Every morning, she'd wave to me from her porch while watering her flowers. My grandchildren stopped by after school to help her in the garden. And every Sunday, our family gathered for dinner without anyone feeling like they were an inconvenience. One afternoon, my grandson asked Grandma why she smiled so much these days. She laughed softly and said, because I finally live somewhere I'm never afraid of being a burden. I had to excuse myself for a moment because I didn't want anyone to see the tears in my eyes. Not long afterward, I heard through mutual friends that Linda was living alone. She had told people our marriage ended because I'd become distant. She never mentioned the 4 words that had started everything. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe saying them out loud would have forced her to face the person she'd become. As for me, I never spoke badly about her. Bitterness is a heavy suitcase. I carried it long enough. Instead, I spent my time where it mattered, with my mother, my son, my grandchildren, and the people who understood that kindness isn't measured by grand gestures. It's measured by whether you show up when someone needs help moving a dresser, or whether you tell them to figure it out themselves. People sometimes ask if I regret ending a marriage that lasted 34 years. My answer always surprises them. I don't regret the years I spent loving someone. I only regret the years I spent explaining away behavior that should never have been accepted. The greatest lesson my mother ever taught me wasn't spoken in words. It was lived through her actions. She spent her life proving that love is patient, generous, and selfless. My wife spent one afternoon proving what happens when those qualities disappear. And I spent the following day making sure the people who had sacrificed everything for me would never again have to wonder if they mattered. Because justice doesn't always arrive with lawyers, judges, or dramatic speeches. Sometimes justice is simply this: the people who treat others as burdens eventually discover what it feels like to carry the weight of their own choices, and the people who spend a lifetime choosing kindness never truly grow old, because they remain forever at home in the hearts of those they loved.